Hi there, and welcome to our latest edition of Money Talks, where we take a look at all aspects of the rural economy as it affects you in the ag sector. In this edition, in the cutthroat world of international markets, especially China, how can New Zealand farmers sell? Special insights from a top American expert now living here who warns the Asian giant needs careful handling. We're trading more and more with Australia and Asia, but will it be enough to offset an expected growth slowdown in the US and Europe? And with another global dairy trade auction just completed, what can we predict for those all-important white gold prices? All this and much, much more coming up. But first, let's get the inside oil on the latest agribusiness data, courtesy of ASB rural economist James Shortall, who's here with all the must-know info. James, welcome back.
Good to be back.
You've been down in Canterbury investigating the quake, and I see from your September agribusiness report, it's really knocked farmers, natural events.
Yeah, I was down in Christchurch last week, and it was really surprising to see some of the areas of the city that have really been destroyed, but also surprising that 1 month on, then a lot of buildings have been completely demolished, all the rubble's been gone, and some of the rebuilding phase, I guess, will get underway over the next sort of 6 months. So things have got underway pretty quickly over 4 weeks, but when you look at it on an agribusiness sort of scale of events, then it's been quite significant. September has not been a good month, generally seen as the spring, the early part of the season, and really farmers set themselves up for the next year. And it hasn't been a good start with the southern storm, the earthquake, not only parts of South Island, but also parts of the North Island. My parents have a beef farm in the lower North Island, and they've had a really wet start to the season, and that's going to have an impact on production in the coming year, I think.
In your opinion, are Canterbury losses going to continue to climb? What's your take on that?
Oh, potentially. I think we're only sort of scratching the surface on some of the issues. I think the biggest issue for rural business and for agriculture potentially is the water sources, and what impact that's had on bores, irrigation. We won't know that for another couple of months really, and it's really going to be in the thick of summer when those irrigation services are really required that we may have a bit more impact. And
strong growth, of course, is predicted, but how quickly before the rebuilding kicks in?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a couple of months, really. I think it's going to have some immediate impacts. Businesses in Christchurch, and some of them have had to shut down. There's been losses of stock. There's been losses of product, business interruption. That's going to have an impact it has had an impact over the past 4 weeks. It's going to continue for the next probably couple of months before we start to see, a bit of a surge in building and things like that. But, there's been a huge amount of a loss of wealth for people. There's been big impacts on people's lives, and some of that, unfortunately, will never be recovered.
And how's it going to affect the rest of us in the New Zealand economy? What are you picking for growth?
Yeah, so, in the third quarter of this year, it's going to have the biggest impact. So it's going to probably shave off a couple of, or about 0.5% or a little bit less than that on economic growth. We had GDP figures out for the second quarter just recently, and they were much, much softer than we had predicted.
Down 0.2% lower than you thought.
Well, actually, the market was predicting about 0.8% growth. GDP figures came in at 0.2%. So that's, basically that's 1 quarter of the growth that many people were expecting. That's pretty significant, and it does indicate that the economy is still pretty soft. It's going to continue to be soft with the effects of the earthquake, and we may see a bit of a pickup, but that's not going to be until probably the fourth quarter or the first quarter of next year.
Overall, how did agricultural activity perform?
Agricultural activity in the second quarter of this year then was down, and that was because of the drought that we did see in Northland, and it did have a bigger impact on production, and then it also flowed through to manufacturing, which of course is driven a lot by what happens with agriculture. In the third quarter of this year then, agriculture actually did perform not too bad. I think that it is continuing to be a good driver for the New Zealand economy. We're seeing strong international prices for our agricultural products, and it's going to continue to be very important for us.
What should we be aware of now when we move into the sectors? Let's talk dairy, of course, #1 exporter. How's it doing?
Well, overnight we had the latest global dairy trade auction. Prices did slip marginally, mainly for the whole milk and skim milk powders, but I think in context that's still really positive because prices have increased a lot over the past couple of months, and they remain at very, very high levels historically. So the fact that they have decreased only slightly, I think it's much of a muchness. Prices remain fairly stable, and that's good news for the milk price for this year.
And as a company, how's Fonterra really doing? What are you picking from their financial information?
Yeah, well, they did release their latest annual results, and I think they were actually pretty positive. They announced their second highest payout ever, a good dividend cash flow back to farmers, retained some, a little bit more than typically what they do, but that is within their policy. They retain one-off items, and they did see a big one-off with the sale of some assets overseas in the past year. So that's within their policy. In terms of their balance sheet, they're actually looking pretty strong. So they're a little bit, their gearing ratio was at 44.9%. That's just below their policy of between 45 and 50%. They've had some fairly strong uptake for shares. They've paid a lot of debt down, so they're in a pretty good position. When you consider what a lot of other companies have done over the past 2 years with the global financial crisis, then Fonterra's come through it relatively well and are in a good position going forward.
As opposed to the lamb sector, let's talk about them. Although lamb schedule prices are on the move again.
Yeah, lamb schedule prices are actually looking pretty good right now, sort of up around that $6 per kilo basis. And over the past probably 3 to 4 weeks, they have increased above last year levels for the first time in 2010. So that's positive. What we're seeing overseas in our international markets, and their prices are still looking really strong, particularly from the UK. They are at very, very high levels, and I think that's I've been quite impressed with what's been happening in that particular part of the international market, because it does indicate that UK consumers can soak up a little bit more in terms of price, which is good for farmers back here in New Zealand. I think schedules are looking pretty good, although there's going to be some impacts on with what's happening with the currency. The pound still remains very, very weak. The UK government starting to really push into some of their budget measures and austerity measures. So, that's going to take a few dollars out of the wallets of UK consumers, and it could have an impact, I guess.
Stay tuned. We'll follow this story. Thanks, James. Coming up after the break, when it comes to doing business with the Asian juggernaut China, what do we need to know and do? We talk to a global business expert with her top tips for success for our exporters. But first, a question for you in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. How much two-way trade does New Zealand anticipate with China over the next 5 years? A hint, it's double the amount it is now. The answer right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much two-way trade does New Zealand anticipate with China over the next 5 years? The answer, $20 billion. Joining us now is Usha Haley, a professor of international business at Massey University, fresh from Harvard Kennedy School in the U.S., where she studied the growth of Chinese businesses in the steel, glass, paper, and forestry industries. She's the author of several books, including The Chinese Tao of Business, and a research associate at the U.S.-based think tank, The Economic Policy in Washington. Usha, welcome to New Zealand, first of all.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Now, listen, you have lived all over Asia, researching and working on emerging international markets.
Yes.
We, of course, supply a lot of agricultural exports to China. What do we need to know?
Oh, Genevieve, where do I begin? With China, the amount is not as important as what New Zealand exports. So in this case, more isn't necessarily better. What is happening in the pattern of trade between New Zealand and China is that New Zealand is exporting commodities with low margins, primarily wood and agricultural products, and importing from China manufactured goods. And this is skewing manufacturing patterns in New Zealand.
James, I think you would agree that most people in New Zealand, certainly in the agribusiness sector, see China as the great savior.
Oh, of course. I mean, if we hadn't been exporting a lot to China over the past couple of years, then the New Zealand economy would be in quite a different position than what it is currently. But there is perhaps, some risk to being too reliant on the Chinese economy and too reliant on China in terms of their imports of New Zealand products. So there's something to be wary of in coming years, for sure.
Usha, what are some of the things we should be aware of? What are some of the dangers for us getting into bed, if you like, too closely with Chinese business?
Well, something interesting happened a couple of weeks ago in the Senkaku Islands between Japan and China. And as a result of that tiff, China withheld exports of rare earth materials to Japan. Now, it did eventually catapult and give these rare earth materials back to Japan, but that sort of thing, being held hostage by China, is an important strategic consideration that New Zealand needs to take into account. And so what I suggest to most large companies is diversify sourcing and diversify who your major customer is so that there is more of an equally distributed power relationship.
Now, in many of the industries you've examined and investigated, what happens is China seems to go from being almost a bit player on the world stage to, in a very, very quickly, a major power broker. Talk to me about that.
Oh, Jen, it's fascinating. I think it's one of the biggest stories of the 21st century. China's move from becoming a bit player in so many industries to becoming the largest producer and the largest exporter in the world in these industries.
But what's wrong with that? I mean, maybe they're just learning how to make paper, for example, a lot more efficiently than the United States.
Well, would that were the case, but that isn't the case. What is happening here is subsidies. And subsidies are against or violate WTO regulations, for example.
World Trade Organization.
Yeah. And China has been subsidizing to the extent of 30 to 40% of the manufactured product in that industry. So it's these aren't small amounts of money that we're talking about. And it really has direct ramifications, for example, with New Zealand for forestry and forest product exports to China.
Yeah, now let me stop you right there. James, we've been doing boom business, apparently, exporting logs, for example, to China. Talk to me a bit about that. Where are we at? Because people here think it's terrific.
Well, I mean, log exports to China and prices over this past year have increased by astronomical levels. So it's been a real success story over the past 12 months. Probably a few factors going on there, some changes with Russian tariffs and their exports going to the Chinese market has provided some benefit for us here in New Zealand. But yeah, it has definitely been a good story and has also offset some of the decreases we've seen in other markets, particularly the US with their building sector and lower economic growth. So China, again, similar to the dairy and other markets, then forestry has been a success story over the past 12 months.
I think the feeling here, too, is that because we're doing so well now exporting logs, for example, to China, it's going to go on forever. What do you say?
Exactly, Jen. It's not going to go on forever. My study showed that China is putting enormous amounts of subsidies into its own forestry industry. Now, China currently has a very small forestry sector. And so China has become the largest importer of pulp in the world. But the massive subsidies that are going into these sectors, the forestry sector in particular, subsidies to buy